He leaned in close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath brush against my skin, and murmured, "We've already chosen where you'll be buried." I didn't react. At 76, you learn how to keep your face calm even when something inside you cracks or rearranges itself into something colder. I adjusted the edge of my cardigan, smoothing it with steady fingers, and turned my gaze toward the kitchen window. Outside, late-season wind pushed dry leaves across the yard, restless and uneasy, like thoughts that refused to settle. "That's not something you joke about," I said. My voice sounded composed. My heart was not. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. That's how I knew he meant it. I had seen that look before, years ago, when he was barely a teenager, standing in the driveway, insisting he hadn't shattered the neighbor's window. The same dangerous blend of guilt and confidence. The kind that tests boundaries just to see if anyone will stop him. No one did back then. Maybe that's where all of this began. He stepped away as if nothing serious had been said, sliding his hands into the pockets of his new coat. "I'm only looking out for you, Aunt Margaret," he said. "Living alone isn't practical anymore." Practical. People always reach for that word when they're preparing to take something. I lifted the kettle from the stove, welcoming the heat against my palm. "I've lived in this house for 43 years, I replied. "Your uncle and I built it ourselves." He smiled thinly. "Times change." Behind him, his wife lingered near the doorway, pretending to scroll through her phone. She was very good at pretending concern, pretending affection, pretending not to flinch whenever she sat on my furniture as if age itself might stain her clothes. Once, she hadn't realized I was nearby. I heard her whisper, "She's clinging to that land out of habit. She won't be around much longer anyway." As though my life were already penciled into their calendar. My nephew cleared his throat, shifting from menace to persuasion. "There's a care facility I told you about. They have availability. Laura and I have discussed it. This house is too large, too old. And the property." He stopped himself. Too abruptly. That was the moment something inside me stirred awake. Years ago, my husband kept documents locked away, deeds, hand-drawn maps, contracts written in an older script, from a time when paper carried weight. I hadn't opened that drawer since the day he died. Some memories are sealed not because they're forgotten, but because they hurt too much to touch. But now, hearing my nephew stumble over the word property, clarity sliced through me. He knew something. Or thought he did. I poured tea into my cup. My hand shook slightly. He noticed. He always notices weakness first. Stepping closer, he softened his voice into the tone he used on clients who didn't yet realize they were being guided. "Nothing bad is going to happen," he said. "We just want to keep you safe." Safe. Another word that rarely means what it claims. When they finally left, their hugs felt rehearsed, careful, hollow. I remained standing at the kitchen table long after the door closed behind them. The house creaked softly as the wind pressed against the roof, the same way it always had. Usually, those sounds comforted me. That day, it felt like the house was holding its breath. I set my teacup down and walked into the study. The drawer resisted at first, swollen with years of humidity, but I pulled harder. The smell of old paper rose into the air, thick with memory. There were folders tied with twine. Yellowed envelopes. A map whose edges had been chewed by time. And at the bottom, the deed. My husband's handwriting was still visible in the corner. Faded, but unmistakable. For her alone. "Promise me she'll keep it." My hands went still. Outside, the wind intensified, rattling the windows. My nephew had spoken of graves. But he had no idea whose ground he was standing on. Morning has a way of exposing everything you try to ignore in the dark. Pale light slipped through the curtains, dull and unforgiving, and for a few quiet seconds I lay still, pretending the day before hadn't happened. But memory is punctual. By the time my feet touched the floor, his voice had already returned, low, close, deliberate. "We've already chosen your grave." The kettle hummed in the kitchen, the same familiar sound it had made for decades. It used to comfort me. That morning, it didn't. The house carried traces of Laura's visit the way it always did, her sharp perfume lingering in the hallway, the refrigerator door not quite shut, a coaster left crooked on the table. She never touched anything directly, always with the tips of her fingers, as if my home were contaminated by age. She thought I didn't notice. People forget how observant you become when life slows you down. I sat at the table with my tea, hands wrapped around the warm mug. My joints protested as they always did in the morning, but that pain was familiar, almost friendly. What wasn't familiar was the tension my nephew had left behind, heavy and invasive, like a stranger who refused to leave. Around 9, there was a knock at the door. Soft. Careful. Not him. It was Helen from next door, her gardening hat tilted slightly, a small jar of homemade jam tucked under her arm. "You weren't at church last week," she said as she stepped inside without waiting. "Everything all right?"
I'm fine, he answered.
The lie settled between us, dense and awkward. Helen's eyes softened, then sharpened. "I heard someone asking about your back acreage," she said lightly, as though commenting on the weather. A young man. Didn't recognize him. Something cold slid deeper into my chest. So it had already begun. Helen didn't stay long, but her words lingered. Someone asking about land that wasn't theirs. Land my husband had bought with the stubborn certainty of a man who planned ahead, even when the present was fragile. We had worked that soil with our hands. Planted trees. Buried 3 beloved dogs beneath it. It was the last piece of him the world hadn't tried to take. That afternoon, Laura returned. No call. No warning. Just her standing in the doorway, smile fixed carefully into place. "I wanted to check on you," she said. "Yesterday must have been a lot." I studied her for a moment. She avoided my eyes, scanning the room like an inspector. "What exactly do you think overwhelmed me?" I asked. She blinked. "Well, conversations about the future can be difficult for someone your age." There it was. "I'm not leaving this house," I said. She sighed the way people do when they believe they're being patient. "We only want what's best. A safer environment. Medical staff. Structure." "Thomas didn't mention safety," I replied. "He mentioned arrangements." For a fraction of a second, her expression slipped. She adjusted a vase that didn't need adjusting. "He worries," she said lightly. "About responsibility. About the land. It's a lot for him." Easier for whom, I wondered. When she finally left, the house seemed to relax. I sank into my chair, staring at the walls my husband had painted, the shelves he had built, the worn places on the floor where his boots had pressed for years. Something settled inside me then. Not fear. Not anger. Resolve. They believed I was fading. That time had loosened my grip on reality. But they didn't understand what kind of woman I had been shaped into. I had buried my husband without letting my voice break. I had survived storms, debts, silence, and years of loneliness without calling anyone to rescue me. Age had softened my body. Not my mind. That night, sleep didn't come easily, not because I was afraid, but because clarity has weight. The house creaked in the wind, as if waiting. And by morning, I knew exactly where to begin. The study was colder than the rest of the house, as it always had been. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and opened the drawer again. Dust lifted into the air, familiar and strangely respectful. Letters. Old receipts. Hand-drawn maps. And the folder tied with frayed string. Inside were documents older than my marriage. Deeds. Property lines measured with care from another era. I traced the embossed seal with my fingers, feeling its authority. Behind the last page, the note waited. For her alone. I carried the folder into the kitchen, letting the sunlight reveal every crease and stain. Slowly, deliberately, I read. The land, every inch of it, had been transferred fully to me years ago. It had never belonged to Thomas. Not even in theory. The calm that followed wasn't relief. It was something deeper. Like the ground shifting back into place beneath my feet. I made a sandwich and sat by the window. That's when I noticed the tire tracks, fresh, wide, unfamiliar. Someone had already been here. Surveyor. Developer. Or worse. They hadn't waited. I returned to the table and read the fine print again. It took time, but the meaning was clear. No one could sell that land without me. No one could speak for it unless I allowed them to. In the metal lockbox, beneath old photographs and my husband's pocket knife, I found the envelope sealed with wax. Inside, a single line. If anyone ever threatens the land, go to Harris. He'll know what to do. Harris. William Harris. The lawyer my husband trusted when things were too important to speak of casually. I closed the box gently. This was no longer about casual cruelty or rehearsed concern. This was preparation. And they believed I was already gone. By morning, the cold had sharpened. The air felt brittle, stretched thin, as if the season itself were holding tension. I stood at the sink rinsing an apple when I noticed movement near the fence line. A figure, too far away to recognize, walked slowly along the boundary before disappearing behind the cedars. They didn't linger. The feeling of being watched doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly, like a scent you can't place at first. Yesterday's tire tracks. Today's silhouette. The pattern was forming whether I wanted to see it or not. After breakfast, I followed the long path behind the house, the one my husband and I used to walk every evening. The blackberry vines tugged at my skirt, the grass bent beneath my steps, yellowed by the season. When I reached the small rise overlooking the back acreage, I saw it immediately. Fresh boot prints. Measuring marks near the old stakes. So much for concern about my safety. On my way back, I ran into Helen again, bundled in her jacket, trimming dead flowers with practiced hands. You look troubled, she said. I saw someone near the back property again, I replied. She grimaced. Developers have been sniffing around town for months. You know how council meetings go. They'd pave over history if it meant profit. I hesitated, then asked, Did Thomas mention anything to you? She shook her head. Only that he's handling some property matters. She didn't bother hiding her disapproval. He should be talking to you. That afternoon, Thomas returned. This time he didn't soften his tone or mask his impatience. He rang the bell twice, hard and sharp, like someone collecting a debt. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, jacket unzipped, breath fast. We need to have a serious discussion, he said. Laura followed behind him, eyes darting around the room as if expecting to catch me in the act of doing something forbidden, signing papers perhaps. Thomas paced the living room, then stopped abruptly. The property is becoming a liability, he said. Erosion issues. Maintenance. You don't have the resources to manage all this. This land has stood nearly a century, I replied. It's managed just fine. Things change, he snapped. You can't live like it's decades ago. You need support. Support. I asked evenly. Or control. His jaw tightened. Laura inhaled sharply. You're twisting my words, he said. I never meant. You told me you'd already chosen my grave, I said. Silence dropped hard between us. His mouth opened, then closed. He ran a hand through his hair, the same tell he'd had since childhood when caught in a lie. Fine, he muttered. Maybe I exaggerated. But you're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm not signing anything, I said. For the first time, he looked at me not as an obligation, not as aging family, but as an obstacle. This isn't going to stop what's coming, he said quietly. I can stop you, I replied. Something flickered across his face. Calculation. Then a thin smile. Think about it, he said. I'll be back tomorrow. When they left, the house returned to its steady breathing. The documents still lay open on the kitchen table, patient and unmoved. Tomorrow, I would go to Harris. That night, clarity replaced restlessness. Fear strikes quickly, sharp and loud. What settled over me was slower, heavier, like fog spreading across a field, refusing to lift. The next morning, I dressed with care. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I chose the dark wool skirt with the firm waistband, the blouse that had survived more years than most of Thomas's friendships. The drive to Harris's office took nearly 40 minutes. The town beyond mine felt louder, faster, filled with people who didn't look where they were going. His office hadn't changed. Brick walls, narrow windows, a sign faded enough to feel respectable. Inside, the receptionist looked up. Do you have an appointment? No, I said. But my name is Margaret Doyle. She disappeared briefly, then returned with a nod. He'll see you. Harris had aged. Thinner hair, slower movements. But his eyes were sharp, assessing. Margaret, he said, standing carefully. It's been a long time. I'm afraid I'm here because it matters, I replied. I laid the documents across his desk. He read slowly, thoroughly. When he looked up, recognition settled into his expression. Your husband was meticulous, he said. You retain full ownership. No shared claims. No provisions favoring your nephew. Someone will challenge it, I said. He didn't question that. Then you're here at exactly the right time. He explained my options calmly: trusts, protections, restrictions. Not to frighten me, but to arm me. When I left his office, the cold air felt sharper, but I breathed easier. Thomas thought he held the board. He didn't realize I owned the game. By the time I returned home, the wind had picked up, scattering dry leaves across the gravel like nervous thoughts. I stayed in the car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting Harris's words settle. Protection wasn't abstract anymore. It was real. Formal. And Thomas had no idea how quickly the ground beneath him was disappearing. Inside, the late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the floor. I spread the papers on the kitchen table again. This time, they didn't feel like remnants of the past. They felt like instruments, tools waiting to be used. Harris had laid everything out clearly. I could place the land into a private trust under my control. I could revoke every permission I'd ever granted. I could decide who would carry responsibility forward. Thomas didn't have to exist in those plans at all. Around 5, I heard a car door slam. Heavy steps followed, purposeful and angry. Thomas didn't knock politely. He struck the door twice, sharp and demanding. What's all this? He asked the moment he stepped inside, eyes locking onto the documents. My business, I said. You shouldn't be handling legal paperwork alone, he snapped. You don't understand what you're signing. I understand exactly what I haven't signed. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. There are developers waiting. This land is an opportunity. So you admit it, I said. You've already been negotiating. He faltered, just enough. It'll be mine eventually, he said without thinking. The truth landed between us, heavy and undeniable. I slid a document toward him. Read the heading. His eyes scanned the page. His face flushed. What is this? The end of your plans, I replied. You can't shut me out, he said. This affects everyone. It affects me. The anger showed then, raw, unmasked. You're making a mistake you can't undo. I know exactly what I'm doing. He left abruptly, promising to return. I didn't answer. The next morning, he didn't. Instead, Laura arrived. Soft knock. Careful smile. She perched on the couch, hands clasped, eyes wide with concern that felt practiced. I'm worried about Thomas, she began. He's under so much pressure. Pressure from what? I asked. This property situation. He feels responsible for you. I never asked him to. She leaned closer. We're family. Decisions should be shared. They were being made without me. Her smile thinned. He's afraid you're preparing something behind his back. I am, I said. She didn't expect honesty. People like Laura never do. You forget something, I continued. I lived alone longer than you've been married. I managed this land when Thomas couldn't tie his shoes. She stood, unsettled. I'll tell him you're still considering.
I'm deciding.
After she left, the house felt quieter, but not empty. Focused. The next day, I called the land assessor. He arrived just after noon. Calm, methodical. He walked the boundary lines carefully, knelt to examine the soil, brushed moss from an old marker stone. After nearly an hour, he straightened. This land is extremely valuable, he said. More than most realize. I felt the weight of it settle. Developers would compete for this. I won't be selling, I said. He smiled faintly. Then you're sitting on a small fortune. When he left, I placed his report beside the trust documents. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. This wasn't just greed. It was expectation. They believed my life was nearing its end, and that everything I owned should begin tilting toward them. That night, I didn't turn on the television. The house had its own rhythm. I sat at the table reading numbers until they no longer startled me. The next morning, I made calls. The bank manager confirmed everything twice. Accounts frozen. Access revoked. Yes, I said. Today. Then Harris. We scheduled the final signing. I drafted revocations for every privilege Thomas had ever been given. My hand was steady as I signed. By noon, it was done. When my phone buzzed with Thomas's messages, confusion, anger, demands, I turned it face down. For the first time in years, my tea tasted exactly as it should. Thomas arrived before sunset. I saw his car from the kitchen window, gravel spraying as he pulled in too fast, like a man already convinced he'd lost control. He slammed the door and marched toward the house, shoulders tight, jaw set. He didn't knock. He pounded. I opened the door slowly. What did you do? He demanded. The bank froze everything. My payments declined. I spoke, I said calmly. You didn't listen. He pushed past me, storming into the living room, his voice rising with each step. You're jeopardizing everything. The finances. The negotiations. Negotiations. I repeated. For land you don't own? He stopped, just for a second. I'm securing our future, he said. You won't be here forever. There it was.
No poulišť. No disguise.
I sat at the table and folded my hands. Sit down, Thomas. He didn't, but he stopped pacing. I've spoken with a lawyer, I said. His eyes widened. Why would you do that? You forced me to. I'm your family, he said. You're supposed to trust me. I trusted you for years, I replied. With money. With access. With decisions. And each time you took more. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration cracking his composure. You're letting ideas get into your head. You put them there, I said. The day you told me you'd chosen my grave. He froze. The silence stretched. His face drained, then flushed. I didn't mean. You did, I said quietly. For a moment, he looked smaller. Almost lost. I realized then that what he wanted wasn't responsibility. It was the reward without the weight. I'm not dying, I said. And even if I were, I decide what happens to my home. His voice dropped. So that's it? You're cutting me out. I'm protecting what your uncle left me, I said. And myself. He left angry, then uncertain, then quiet. The next morning, he didn't come back. Instead, the day unfolded slowly. I watered the plants my husband once teased me about. I watched frost settle across the grass like a held breath. At noon, Laura's silver car appeared. She knocked softly. Apologetically. I'm worried, she said once inside. Thomas is overwhelmed. He should be, I replied. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. You're considering legal steps. That would devastate him. Decisions about my land, I said. We're family, she insisted. We should decide together. You decided without me. Her smile cracked briefly. People your age living alone. My age. I echoed. She swallowed. Changed tactics. Imagine if something happened to you. You imagine that often, I said. When I told her I was preparing protections, not considering them, she finally understood. She left without warmth. That afternoon, I called the assessor. When he returned his evaluation, the numbers confirmed what Thomas already knew, and what he'd hidden. The land wasn't just valuable. It was transformative. Expectation, not concern, had driven everything. I placed the report beside the trust papers. A stack of truth. That night, the house felt taller. Steadier. Thomas texted again. Then called. I ignored it all. The next day, I finalized the trust. Harris's office felt different this time. Not urgent. Intentional. Who would you like to name as successor? He asked. Emily, I said without hesitation. He nodded. A wise choice. I signed slowly. Deliberately. The ink dried. The decision held. When I returned home, I unplugged the phone. That evening, I stood by the window watching the land stretch wide and calm beneath the darkening sky. The ground they wanted had never loosened beneath me. They'd just mistaken my silence for surrender. I didn't need anyone to tell me Thomas would act quickly. Desperation has a rhythm. If you've lived long enough, you learn to hear it before it arrives. Mid-morning, I noticed unfamiliar cars slowing near the driveway. Then another pulled in behind the first. Not neighbors. Not deliveries. These vehicles carried a shine that didn't belong to this road. Men stepped out, coats too thin for the cold, shoes untouched by real soil. They spoke with quick confidence, gestures sharp and practiced. Then Thomas arrived, smoothing his jacket, arranging his face into that professional smile he'd rehearsed his entire life. He didn't look toward the house. He led them straight toward the back acreage. In his mind, the land was already his. I buttoned my coat slowly, letting time move at its own pace. Truth doesn't require speed. It only requires presence. The frost clung to the grass as I walked the familiar path behind the house. When I reached the rise, Thomas was pointing across the field, his voice carrying pieces of a sales pitch. Excellent elevation. Minimal grading. High potential. One of the men glanced toward the farmhouse. And the owner? She'll be relocating soon, Thomas said. We're handling the transition. I stepped forward then. The sound of my footsteps was quiet but deliberate. Thomas turned, and the color drained from his face. You shouldn't be out here, he said quickly. It's cold. I live here, I replied. And I walk my land when I choose. The men straightened, uncertain. I reached into my coat and removed the envelope Harris had prepared. These documents, I said calmly, handing them to the nearest investor, outline the legal status of this property. He scanned the pages. His expression changed immediately. Irrevocable trust, he murmured. Full control retained. The others exchanged glances. Professional. Detached. Finished. Without another word, they left. Thomas stood frozen, breath uneven. You blindsided me, he whispered. No, I said gently. I protected myself. I turned and walked back toward the house. Behind me, he called my name, not in anger, not with authority, but with the hollow sound of someone realizing the ground no longer belonged to him. The next morning, Thomas returned alone. He looked different. Smaller. He stood in the kitchen where the papers had once been spread out. You named Emily, he said quietly. Yes. I thought that would be me. It was never promised, I replied. And I'm still alive. He stared at his hands. What am I supposed to do now? Live your own life, I said. Not the one you planned to inherit. He apologized, not cleanly, not completely, but honestly enough. When he left, the house settled again. The days that followed felt clearer. I walked the land slowly, touching the bark of the oak we planted decades ago. Emily visited, sitting beside me on the porch without expectations, without entitlement. I'll take care of it, she said quietly. I know, I replied. That evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the field stretch wide under the fading light. Dignity doesn't arrive loudly. It returns in stillness. When you choose yourself without explanation. When you protect what was always yours. When you realize age isn't erasure, it's perspective. They had already chosen my grave. What they hadn't understood was this. I was still standing. And the land knew exactly who it belonged to.